In this recording, we're going to take a look at how to load some data into a SQLite3 database. We're just going to use a standard kind of import with a regular connection. And along the way, I want to kind of show a little bit of how I work with VS Code or Visual Studio Code. It's a desktop editor, and maybe a few a few tricks and tips along the way. So we're going to start. We'll take a look over here at my Explorer window. So I just created a folder in my projects. I have a projects folder, and I called it SQLite3 example. You can see here, and in SQLite3, I've put a data file in there already. No reason to do that ahead of time other than I had some stuff already written in rather than record watching that happen. And I created a data folder, and this is where I'm going to put my data file. And we can take a look when we get into VS Code exactly what this data is, and read a little bit about it. And so I just want to kind of start off with this is where my project lives. It's just in a folder off of projects. And so a couple of things. You can start VS Code by right-clicking, and if you're in Windows 10, or rather Windows 11, you'll have to go to Show More Options. And in Show More Options, you can notice you can open with code. So right here, this will open with VS Code immediately and open that file. If not, we can swap over here to the VS Code window, and you can see when I first opened VS Code, I selected the Explorer, and it gives me right away the option to open a folder or to clone a repository. In other words, if there's a Git repository that's already out in GitHub and I want to just get a copy of that, I could start with a cloned repository. But we're going to start by opening a folder because that folder is available to us. And then we're going to show you how to connect it up to GitHub using VS Code as well. So we're going to go ahead and look for our file, and it was called SQLite3 example. And we're just going to go ahead and open that folder. Piece of cake. We see our data.load file, and we also see our data file. Now, I'm taking a look at the markdown file that describes the drinks.csv. And you'll notice this folder contains the data behind a particular story called Dear Mona, Where Do People Drink the Most Beer, Wine, and Spirits? It's from the 538 blog. If you want to go ahead and read about that, feel free to go ahead. And it tells us the source of the data here and also that the average serving size per person. That's helpful, but let's take a look at the data file itself. And so when I click at the data file, we can see the data basically has the first row, as is typical with CSV files. The first row kind of tells us what each of the different common delimited data fields are. So country is the first one, and then the number of beer servings, followed by the spirit servings, followed by the wine servings, and then the total liters of pure alcohol. And so you can see we've got a couple of hundred rows, I guess, or about 194 rows from Zimbabwe all the way up to Afghanistan. And this is a fine way to look at it. The nice thing about CSV files is they're text-based, so we can look at them in any editor. There's all kinds of extensions we could install associated with CSV files. And so if I go into VS Code, I can look at an extension, for instance, that converts a CSV to an ASCII formatted table. I can turn it into a markdown table. I can even use a viewer on it, an Excel viewer for Excel files and CSV. So that's pretty handy. You'll notice I've installed an extension already, and so there's a button up here that gets added to my CSV file called Edit CSV. And if I press that button, I can kind of see things more in more the table format that we expect. and it assumes that the first row doesn't have the column headers. And so what we want to do is on our read options, we want to just tell it it has headers. We can close that up, and now we can actually see. And if we wanted to make changes to our file, like delete a particular column or what have you, we can hit this button here, or somehow or another change the name of the headers, etc. Just kind of a handy thing to go do with VS Code. All right, so now that we've got to take a look at that, immediately I've got some files here already, and they're not in GitHub. But one of the first things that I like to do is make sure that I've captured my file changes, so that anything that happens, I'm good to go. And so at this point, we're going to go ahead and actually add this. We're going to create a repository, and we're going to add these things to it. And so built into VS Code again is the source control add-in. And so we're going to go over here. It looks kind of like a little branch, I guess. And we'll notice immediately that we have two options. We can see that we can initialize our repository, and we can publish it to GitHub. So let's go ahead and initialize our repository to begin with. What this is saying is, all right, we're going to set up our repository with our very first commit. Notice we have all the changes here. If we want, we can go ahead and take a look at the changes, the differences between what was there and what was there previously. And in these two particular cases, or in all these cases, they are untracked files. So they're brand new files that we haven't added. The nice thing about VS Code and some of the tools is it does the add and commit at the same time. So one of the common things to do when we first get started is go ahead and put in an initial commit message, and usually I just call it initial commit. And so we're going to go ahead and commit those changes. Fantastic. And now that we have the changes committed locally, we can see that we have a branch called main. We can also see this little icon down here shows us that it hasn't been pushed to GitHub. And so the next thing we're going to do, and it even tells us here, we're going to publish that branch. And so it's going to ask us where to publish it to. I've set up GitHub previously. So when you install GitHub, you may be asked for your credentials in order to set it up. You'll go through that. But I'm going to go ahead and publish it to a public repository called SQL3 example. And you'll notice the changes are synchronized. Fantastic. So when you go back over here to our file explorer, we have our three files. We have our data directory, we have our data load directory. We can see nothing has changed. As soon as we change something in one of these files, for instance, our data load, if I were to make a change here and go back to it, Git notices immediately that we have a change, and we can go ahead and commit this change as well if we wanted to, and go through the same steps. Add a new line at the end of the file. We can commit our change, and then go ahead and sync our changes up to GitHub. Very easy to do. Now, if I'm working in a group, one of the things I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to make changes both here, and I'm going to want to make sure I get their changes. So often I'm going to come down here and take a look, and there may be a button down here that shows the number of changes that I have locally but that haven't been pushed, or a down arrow, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Okay, now let's talk about loading some data into our SQLite database. I've gone ahead and outlined all the steps. One of the things I like to do before I get started writing any code is just to ensure that that I've written out exactly kind of what I'm going to do, and then it becomes really easy for me to figure out how do I execute those steps. So you'll notice I've imported two files. One is the SQLite3 library. The other is called the path library, or a path command from the path lib library. You're welcome to use the OS library if you like. I like the path lib directory, and I'll show you why. So we can define the data to the path, and I'm going to go ahead and create the data folder. And immediately you're seeing this shows us the path. We've created a brand new path, an object, a path object, in other words, a folder object, and we're going to point exactly to where the files are. And so that's on my D drive. I need 2 backslashes because a backslash is an escape character, says take the next character literally. So in that case, I need 2 backslashes. And the name of my folder was actually projects and SQLite3 example, and then the data folder. So this is the path to where I can find my data. Now I can go ahead and set the database file name. You're going to notice, again, one other thing that I've done in my environment, and you're welcome to do so at this point as well, is I've installed an add-in, again back here to our extensions. I've installed another add-in called Copilot from GitHub. Now you're going to have to sign up for GitHub Copilot, and as a student you'll have access to, I believe it's unlimited hours on Copilot. If you didn't use your student ID, or if you didn't align your student ID, you may be limited, but you'll have to check that out. The nice thing about GitHub Copilot, this is like ChatGPT to help us write code. It's really kind of handy. Anyway, so another handy extension you might want to check out. So you'll notice quite a bit when I'm going through typing some of this code out that Copilot is going to offer suggestions, auto completions for me. All right, the next thing I want to do is go ahead and set the DB file name, and immediately we get we get a data folder. And here's the nice thing about path. Once I created the path, now it becomes an object that knows how to deal with basically the division sign. And the division sign in this case tells it to just basically append more path to it. And so my database file name is drinks.db. I could have just as easily done db file name and done a path to, and then specified the whole thing out like so, right? It's the exact same thing. I just think it's a little clearer. If I decide to change where my data path is, I can just change this and it will go ahead and update that. So one way or the other, I end up with the DB file name stored in a variable. All right, fantastic. And the next step, we want to set the actual data file name. This is where we're getting data from. And there's our data file name. Again, it's in the data folder. And so in the data folder, we have a file called drinks.csv, and there we go. So data file, drinks.csv. Now things are very clear. If I need to modify my data file, if I need to somehow connect to my database file rather than searching through all my code and trying to find a huge long path with drinks.db on the end, I can change it in one place. Okay, perfect. We've made some good changes here. The first thing we need to do then, and maybe I should have been a little more clear here. So let's create a section called create the database. And so create the database. Whoops. We're going to do a number of things in create the database. We're going to connect to the database. We're going to create a cursor object. We're going to drop the table if it exists. And then finally, we're going to create the table. And so the first thing we want to do is connect to the database. And so we create a connection called CONN, and again, GitHub Copilot helps us. This you certainly can type this out, but this just kind of gives us a shortcut here. So we're going to go ahead and connect. It's kind of like having Google work immediately in your code. So I've connected to the database. I need to create a cursor object. We know that in order to run commands, we need a cursor object. So I'm going to call my cursor. And again, the cursor is created by calling the cursor function of the connection. We're going to drop the table if it exists. So we're going to make sure that the table doesn't exist already. And so we need to do a cursor and then execute. We're going to execute the SQL command drop table if exists drinks. That's going to be the name of the table that we're going to use. And then once we've dropped it, then we're going to go ahead and create a new one. Okay, well, here's the thing. So here's a case where ChatGPT helped us with the syntax, create drinks, create a table named drinks, and it gave us three fields to create the table from. These aren't the same fields that we have in our code. So what we're going to do is we're going to take what ChatGPT gave us. Thank you, ChatGPT. We're going to go ahead and paste in our own we're going to paste in our own definitions. And so, all right. Remember, if we have strings, we can just add strings together, concatenate them. And so what you see here is we are getting the country name as text. We're getting the number of beer servings as a real, or real means a floating point number, the decimal point number. Spirit servings real, wine servings real, and total liters of pure alcohol is real. Now, in this particular case, all of these happen to be the same names as the names in our CSV file, but that doesn't have to be. That's not a requirement. But we're going to let it go anyway, and we should be good. Okay. And now that we have created our database and created our table, I like to do just a quick check. So this code I'm just going to put in briefly to make sure that our table was created and that it looks like we expect, and then we'll move on. So rather than type all this out, I'm just going to go ahead and paste it. I did this a little bit earlier. And running this code, we see our data project ran, and the output of our select statement shows that we have one table called drinks. Perfect. So it looks like things are okay. Now, I've also added an extension for looking at SQLite, databases. Here's two of them that I've installed. You're welcome to look through the list and see if there's others that you like, or Google your favorite source and figure it out. I've installed the SQLite extension and the SQLite viewer extension. They seem to have a lot of downloads, 1.9 million and 620,000, and they're not invasive. I'm not really dealing with anything too significant, so I figured those might be good to try. And so I see I now have a drinks.db. Let's go see what it looks like in my SQLite viewer. And when I open my SQLite viewer, you'll notice we have a table with drinks, and it has columns country, beer servings, spirit servings, wine servings, and total liters of pure alcohol, just like we had expected. It tells us that we have 5 numbers and a text, which is exactly what what we had in mind, so things seem to be working okay. All right, fantastic. So I'm going to, just for now, I'm going to go ahead and comment these lines out. Control // when you highlight multiple lines, Control / on your keyboard will highlight and rather not, it will take the highlighted fields and it will comment them out. Okay, the next thing we want to do is be able to load up the data from the CSV file. And we want to put all of the changes into the database. So, again, we'll go ahead and do load data from data file, kind of give us a heads up on what this section is going to do. We'll just move those over just a bit. All right. So the very first thing we want to do is we want to load the data from the CSV file. And so again, I can either Google this or I can or I can use ChatGPT to help me, and so that's what I did. So I started typing the for statement, and I'm going to head and assume that it knows what it's doing, and then take a look at it. Okay, it said skip the header row, so that's right. So I agree with that. That looks good. And then it said insert the rows into the table, and it seems to do that correctly. So I can just delete those 2 lines. And then my command says I need to commit the changes. So this is important. When we put data into the database, and it's kind of a 2-step process. The same way we have commits in Git, where we put the changes locally and then we say, yes, we're good, stamp it. We have the same kind of thing with a database. And you may have talked about transactions in your database class. What it means is that we can make sure that all of the changes happen or none of the changes happen, and by requiring a 2-step process. First, we say to write the changes, and then when we have all of the changes written, then we say, okay, now take all of those written changes and put them into the database for good, like make it permanent. And so that's what we're going to do here with our next command. We're going to do our connection, and then we're going to commit the changes. Okay, let's see if this works. So far, it seemed to have run okay. We've got our drinks. Let's go open that file again and take a look, and voila, look at this. We have data in our database. Looks like we've got total liters. We've got all of the lines that we expected. We have Zimbabwe even all the way down to the very end. So things look great. Looks good to us. Looks like we have our data. But if we don't want to necessarily use our tool to make sure it worked, one of the things we can do is go ahead and query that data from the database. And so our next section is really about selecting all the rows from the table in the database, printing out the result, and then closing the cursor and closing the connection. We just want to make sure that we complete the process 100%. And so our next command is to select star from drinks. So this will get us all of the data back from the database. We're going to fetch all of the lines. You've seen this in the query. You've seen this in the query notebooks that I've provided to you, and so this isn't something we're going to spend a bunch of time on. We've printed the result, and then we need to close the cursor. So cursor.close, and we need to close the connection. Again, great. And so if we run that just one more time, look at that. We've got all of the data. It seems like it's come out okay. So we've now essentially created a database, included all of our included all the data that was in the CSV file and shared it to here. We are ready to go. So now that we're done, or at a point where we feel like we can save it, we go back to our GitHub situation and we can take a look. We've got two changes, the data load and the drinks. We can, in data load, it's very straightforward because it's a text file. We can see exactly what's changed by just clicking on the file. It shows us this is what was added. Little plus signs over here between the line numbers show us lines that were added. Minus signs show us things that were deleted between the version that's on the server and the version that we had. And again, some more plus signs here. It's going to be much more difficult to handle the drinks.db and because it's not actually a text file, so we can't really track the changes in our text file. We're just going to have to assume that that our changes are correct. But what we'll notice here is that we've got a U for an untracked file. So that means that it's going to automatically do the add and commit for us. And we're going to go ahead and commit these two things together. And so build the code to load data from CSV. We're going to go ahead and commit it. Now remember, I told you before, when you take a look at it, you can see down here we're on the main branch that we've got 0 changes that need to come down from the server. That's what the little down arrow is, and that 1 going up. So in other words, we are 1 commit ahead of what's on the server. So if we want to get caught up, we would need to sync the changes. We don't need to sync the changes immediately. We can go ahead and continue to make changes to our code if we'd like, and sync the changes at a later time. So let's go do that for a minute. I'm just going to show one more aspect here. I'm going to create a data read. I've also installed the Jupyter extension to Python into VS Code, so we can actually run Jupyter notebooks in our Python in our VS Code project. And so I find this helpful. Sometimes it's super helpful for us to be able to run things locally, What I like about Jupyter is that we can run a cell and that the state stays the same, so we don't have to continue to run it over and over and over again. Like when we ran our code here in the data load, every single time we ran it, we dropped the table and started from scratch. So if I were to want to do something like make changes to that table, I would have to comment out this code, and then when I wanted to or create a function or something to that effect, I would have to comment out this code so that it wasn't dropping and creating a new table every single time. So we can create a new file. Maybe we want to deal with a new Jupyter notebook, and maybe we want to go add our own README file. So let's go ahead and create a new README file. And again, this is Markdown. You've seen Markdown before. Very simply, £sign says a header 1, £sign says a header 2, £sign says a header 3. We can do things like dashes to create bullets, etc. This is our SQLite3 example, and we could write some text about it. Loads data from a database or from a CSV into a SQLite3 database. Perfect. Okay, we go look at our changes here. We see we have 2 new files available to us. Both are untracked. But maybe I'm not quite ready to include the data.read IPMB file just yet. Or it doesn't really go with the README file and make sure that those are committed separately. I can go ahead and just what's called stage the changes. And so you'll remember that we go through kind of that 2-stage commit even locally before we go sync with the server. We stage our changes. We say these are all the changes we want to make, then write them. Right? You'll remember. But it's been kind of hidden from us because we've done the commit add. That's what stages the changes, and then commit or commit and with the message, or git add, and then git commit actually pushes it. And so this is just a way to allow us to get that intermediate stage if we were looking for to be able to separate those two things out, as opposed to adding and committing all in one step. I'm going to go ahead and unstage this change. I'm going to go ahead and commit these 2 new files. Create a couple new files. This is a terrible commit message because it doesn't actually tell me what happened. I haven't explained that I created a new data read notebook and some content about my data. It's just so that's probably a better way to go about it. Let's just say add a README and a Jupyter notebook for querying the database. And I'm going to go ahead and commit those 2 things. Again, we can take a look down here. Now we have 2 commits that haven't been pushed up to the server, and it's probably a good time to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go ahead and I can sync the changes right from, I can use this button here in the source control to sync the changes, or I can come right down here to the taskbar and just press that little button, and notice it synced my changes up to the server. There you go. That's my workflow using VS Code. In this particular case, loading data to a SQLite database using standard SQL, the insert statements that we know and love. There are 2 more examples of how to go ahead and load data to the database using pandas and also SQLite, which I will put a link to as well in the Blackboard. Hope that was helpful.